Welcome, everyone, to the Cold Case panel. I'm Mysti Berry, your moderator. I've written short stories in Alfred Hitchcock, Ellery Queen, and a few anthologies. And when I put on my editor and publisher hat, I publish a charity anthology for voting rights in the US. And so I don't publish my own stories, I publish other people's stories. And I'll be your moderator today. And it'll be my pleasure to introduce everyone with a brief bio, and then we'll start talking about cold cases. And fiction, but also some cold case facts, since we have kind of an expert with this. Well, several experts, actually. Okay, so I'm Mysti. Janet Williams has graciously agreed to help us with tech stuff, and she's going to manage the questions, which we'll hold until about the 45-minute point. So hang on to your questions or put them in the chat, whichever, but we won't get to them till the 45-minute point. Okay. I'd like to introduce Priscilla Paton. And here's where I have to read from my notes. Sorry, guys. Priscilla is a Maine native with a PhD in English literature from Boston College, who now lives in Minnesota. And we were just hearing about the Mississippi right outside her window. She writes mysteries set in the greater Minneapolis and St. Paul area, including the police procedural Where Privacy Dies, featuring the oddball team of Detective Eric Jansen and Detective Deb Metzger. And next in the series is Should Grace Fail, which is available in December. Welcome, Priscilla. Lissa Marie Redmond was born and raised in Western New York and worked in law enforcement for 22 years, including being a detective for high-profile cases. And she also appeared on Dateline, The Nightmare Next Door, and Murder by Numbers as a detective, obviously not as a victim. Her cold case investigation series includes her latest A Full Cold Moon, and she's written a standalone thriller and short stories as well. And these bios are only capturing the headlines for each writer. I encourage you to go to their websites and read more about them. They all have rich, deep backgrounds in writing. Marcia Talley is, welcome, Marcia. Marcia Talley is an Ohio native with an MLS degree from the University of Maryland, and she now divides her time between Annapolis and an antique sailboat in the Bahamas, a fate we all envy. She's written over 20 books and published nearly as many short stories. Her stories have garnered Anthony and Agatha Award nominations and an Agatha win for her story Driven to Distraction. One of her latest books is Tangled Roots, featuring her series character Hannah Ives, who explores family secrets revealed by DNA testing, which is very pertinent to our talk today. And Martin, welcome. Martin Edwards is the latest recipient of the CWA Diamond Dagger. Martin, that's the equivalent of the Edgars in the UK, is that right?
It's the daggers are the equivalents of the Edgars, and the Diamond Dagger is like the Grand Master equivalent.
He's the author of 19 novels, most recently Mortmain Hall and Gallows Court. He received the Edgar, Agatha, H.R.F. Keating, and Poirot Awards, 2 McCavity Awards, the CWA Marjorie Allingham Short Story Prize. I knew I'd have to take a breath. The CWA Short Story Dagger and the CWA Dagger in the Library. Twice nominated for CWA Gold Daggers and once for the Historical Dagger, and shortlisted for the Theakston Prize for Best Crime Novel of the Year for Coffin Trail. His novels include the Harry Devlin series and the Lake District Mysteries, which are cold case mysteries, 9 nonfiction books and 70 short stories. I feel like such a slacker now. He has also edited over 40 anthologies. So welcome, everyone. I'm so excited. So I'm going to start the first question, and I'm just going to have Lissa start. But of course, this is a conversation, so everybody chime in and contribute to each question, please. So the first question is really, we all understand why the family of the victim and the immediate community might care about a cold case for years after it is abandoned. But why is it, do you think, that people invest so much emotion and interest in cold cases that they don't know anyone involved? I'm thinking about the Golden State Killer, and he actually did affect a lot of us in Northern and Southern California, but that became like a national obsession. What do you think it is about cold cases that attract us?
I think it's the idea that the killer is still out there, and that if this person, who I don't know, but is so much like me, can become a victim, then anyone can become a victim. Mm-hmm. And while that unknown person is still out there, it draws in not just the police and the family, but people in the community, because it's a threat to the whole community. It's a threat to the whole community's safety. And so people like Michelle McNamara, who wrote I'll Be Gone in the Dark, which is an excellent book, kind of personifies that group think that if we all just put our heads together, we can find out who this person is that is terrorizing, our area. And it's sort of a protective, a group protective dynamic where, the police only have, so many resources, but if we all get together, then we're all a resource. And I think that's where people start, following cases, watching Discovery ID, getting involved in the message boards, and reading about cold cases.
I think if I may pick up on what you're saying, Lisa, and just in terms of themes, I was thinking from what you said that there can be a greater sense of injustice, a very ample, like you say, with the community. It's with cold cases, particularly if they seem to involve serial crimes, the sense of injustice and fear are much amplified. And I think then the resolution also amplifies certain things too. The other thing I'm thinking of in terms of being a writer is that cold cases, especially if they've been gone for 5 years, 15 years, 1,000 years, they seem impossible to solve at this point. So I think for a writer and setting up your investigators, and you probably lived through this, it's an incredible challenge. This thing has resisted for so long. Why should it give now?
Right. The Jack the Ripper syndrome.
Yes.
I think also this point about justice that Priscilla has made is a really important one, because with a cold case, you have a sense of justice being denied, but sometimes for a very, very long time. And I think also there's a parallel issue which Agatha Christie, who wrote some cold case stories herself, captured really well with the title and theme of a book called Ordeal by Innocence, and the idea that when there's a cold case, the people who are innocent but nevertheless suspected on the basis of there's no smoke without fire are deeply affected, as well as the bereaved. So that sense of being put in jeopardy, even if you're innocent, because the real culprit hasn't been found, is another aspect of the appeal, I think, of cold cases, and the reason why they have such resonance for so many readers as well.
Yeah, I was thinking about the Madeleine McCann case, where her parents were immediately suspected, and also John Benet Ramsey. Both of these cases are unsolved, and both families went through absolute hell. So, and we still don't know what happened to those.
That's exactly the point, and of course it can go on for decades in some cases, and sometimes cases are never resolved, and that's why the possibility of resolution is so attractive. And I think that this idea of resolving uncertainty is something really important in crime fiction as a whole. It's often said that the appeal of detective fiction is about restoring order, but maybe it's also something wider, that we don't like uncertainty, and we're all living with a great deal of uncertainty right now. So that sense of worry is reinforced, but the appeal of a cold case mystery may be the possibility of resolving the uncertainty after many years of having this ongoing anxiety.
Marsha, I'll start with you with my next question, which is closely related, and just sort of flipping the question: what attracts you to writing cold case scenarios? And I'll just leave the question at that.
Well, I think that I got drawn into it by the DNA. I did what a lot of people did. I sent my spit off in a tube and waited for it to come back. And I didn't find anything I didn't know about my own self. I'm relentlessly Puritan from England, coming over to the Massachusetts area. But in the course of doing this analysis, I discovered a cousin that I had lost track of. But more importantly, I discovered that my first cousin was not my biological first cousin, because I was related to his sister's children, but not to his children. So that got me started with the story Entangled Roots. I wondered what would happen if your results came back and it was something totally unexpected. And in this case, Hannah finds out that she's 1/4 Native American, specifically, and then when she traces it down, like a lot of people do through the databases, through family members, she discovers cousins, and the mystery evolves from that. So I love that, pulling on the threads, and you know, the clues come, and you start building the puzzle until the whole picture is there.
Cool. Priscilla, I know that you sort of tackled the privacy side of that in your other book. Can you tell us about that?
In the first one, Where Privacy Dies, the one coming out in December doesn't necessarily have a cold case in it, but in the first one, I was very interested in privacy issues, and I can maybe talk more about that later. But I was sort of following the idea that seems to be both true in life and in fictional mysteries, which is that one murder hides another. Mm-hmm. And often the murder that's being hidden is in the past. You know, my expertise before writing that book was I was a Robert Frost scholar. And you could argue that in one of his early poems, there's a cold case because there are bones hidden in the attic. But other than that, I was sort of coming in through a lot of research. And I do have an acquaintance who's a forensic chemist who is a big help on a lot of this. But in terms of the privacy issue, a lot of there's actually a corporate cover-up in that mystery. An executive's body is found in a wetland. It's been defrosting in the wetlands for several weeks, which makes some evidence collection difficult. And it seems like the corporation he worked for is covering up that crime. But as it goes on, it's covering up another crime. But the corporation's privacy walls are really hampering the investigation in a lot of cases. And I don't deal with that topic in this book, but the ethics of DNA collection through genealogy websites, through abandoned DNA, you know, and maybe some of the other panelists can talk to that. That's very meaty and unsettled stuff, I think, for a writer to get into. A lot of possibility there.
By abandoned DNA, you mean like picking up a cola can or a cigarette butt or a napkin or something like that? Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll circle back to the DNA in just a minute. But Martin, you've written a lot of cold case stuff. Can you tell us what attracts you or what you're looking for when you write it?
Yes, I wrote one series set in Liverpool, and then I wrote a standalone, and the publisher of that book wanted me to write a series with a rural background, and so I thought I'd like to go to the Lake District regularly, have an excuse, place I love. So I started with the idea of the place, and then thinking about the place gave me the idea of the history, because the Lake District is particularly rich in history, literary heritage, and much else. And the Romans settled in the Lake District. So it was this idea of history. And so I had a character who's a historian as one of the two protagonists, and a female police officer. And I started with the historian. In the first book, The Coffin Trail, the police officer, Hannah Scarlett, comes into the story about a third of the way through. And the idea was to have their shared interest in it, because she's the head of the cold case unit and he's interested in the past. So that shared interest would develop into a relationship over a series of books. So that was how it began with me. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought there was so much to do with looking, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, looking at how the past and the present interact with each other. and what was done, as has been said already, what was done years ago, a murder that might have been covered up, or some incident, how that has echoes or cast shadows in the present day. So that was the concept, and I've tried to interpret that quite freely in different ways. And in the 7 books, with the eighth one coming out next year, set in the Lake District. But it began with the idea of history and fascination with the past.
The past and its effect on the present. Yeah, that's cool. Lissa, do you have that, like the detective in the Golden State Killer, do you have that one case that haunts you, or is there something else that brought you to cold case fiction?
There's a lot of cases that still haunt me, but for me, writing my series, my cold case investigation series, and my main character, Lauren Riley, as she bounces from book to book and from cold case to cold case, I get to write the endings of the stories, and they're not always a happy ending, but there's an ending. And unfortunately, in real cold cases, that doesn't always happen. So in a lot of ways, me starting to write my cold case investigation series, even though it's fiction, it's very, very therapeutic for me. It began as very therapeutic for me. And I do bring in, as the series goes on, my latest book, Full Cold Moon, to go back to the DNA, the premise is a young man from Iceland finds out his father is an American, an Air Force man here in the States, and comes over here and he gets murdered. Mm-hmm. And it's while that's happening, there is another cold case that my main character is sort of stuck on. And she keeps reflecting back on this cold case that had happened in the 70s while she's investigating this sort of hot, I hate to use the word hot case that just happened. She's still, as detectives do, you have more than one case at a time. She's still reflecting and thinking. And I believe in the Golden State Killer, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, a person uses the word consumed by the case. And so she's sort of consumed by this cold case that she's never been able to solve as she's working on this other case. And I try to reflect what it's really like to have multiple cases, not just one, but you have to deal with multiple cases at the same time.
Yeah, on TV, it's always the one case till the end. And,
yes.
I can't imagine how difficult that work must be, juggling. There must be dozens of people related to every case and multiple cases. That just is amazing. I'm going to switch tracks for just a minute and ask everybody to think about what's their favorite cold case crime novel or short story or nonfiction that you've read lately that's not your own. And maybe I'll start with Martin. Marsha, go ahead.
Well, Richard III for me. I'm just absolutely consumed by that whole investigation. I've always thought that Richard, ever since I read Daughter of Time, I have been convinced that Richard III did not kill the princes in the tower. We still don't know who killed the princes in the tower, or even if they were murdered at all. But that whole story about the king in the car park and the investigation, and I actually went to the museum there and his beautiful new tomb, and they have a wonderful museum there that outlines the whole investigation process from one end to the other, and also establishes Richard III in British history. That's really, really fascinating. You can also stand right over where his body was. There's a hole in the ground with plexiglass over it. So I highly recommend that. But I'm endlessly fascinated with Richard III.
Cool. Martin, what do you think?
I reread recently another book by Agatha Christie, Five Little Pigs. And that is a cold case mystery. Poirot was asked to look into a case that took place 16 years ago. There was an assumed culprit. And it's really one of Christie's best books. I think it's got a very dark ending if you think about it. I won't say what happens, but there's something very chilling. It is one thing it is not is cozy, but it's also a very well constructed book because there are and just a small number of suspects, the five suspects, and the way that she shifts the suspicion around, and the way that again she shows this interaction between what happened all those years ago and what happens in the present in terms of the story. It's a masterclass in something like 60,000 words of economy and plotting skill. That there is a bit more characterization than you find in many Christie's as well. So I think that's although it's an old book, I think it remains a really good read.
Excellent, thank you. Lissa. I
have to agree with Martin. I am a huge Agatha Christie fan. There's no one better than her. And everything he said, I concur with 100%. I also am, as far as a real life case, I've also always been fascinated with the Lizzie Borden case and how she went to trial and was found innocent, and it's now sort of America's, Britain has Jack the Ripper, and she's sort of our, cold case that has never been solved. What really happened to her family, and there's been wonderful books written on that case. So that's sort of my, fascination with that case.
Yeah, absolutely. And Priscilla.
I'd like to mention two Minnesota mystery novelists. One is Erin Hart, who writes, one of her mysteries is Haunted Ground. And her mysteries are they're split between Minnesota and Ireland. And they pair a contemporary murder mystery with a bog body mystery. So the bog body mystery may go back 10 years or it may go back 1,000 years. So those are sort of a fascinating blend of history and intrigue. And I'd like to mention Jess Lowry has recently published Unspeakable Things. Unspeakable Things itself is not a cold case investigation. It's from the point of view of a young girl, but Jess was inspired by her own childhood. She grew up in the area of Minnesota where I think it was 1989, an 11-year-old boy was abducted, Jacob Wetterling. And this became one of those mysteries that almost destroyed the community, somewhat rural area. And it was only resolved in the, I think 2013 or 2015. And it took essentially improved DNA to go back to one of the earlier suspects. But it was a very circuitous solution. But what Jess is really writing about in that book is partly how a town, even if it means well, keeps a lot of secrets.
That's a great theme. I'm going to pick up the next question with you, which is, and I hope this doesn't throw anybody off that I didn't talk about this beforehand, but what's the most interesting or creepiest or most fascinating thing about DNA or other forensics that you've learned as you've written your cold case stories?
Are you starting with me again?
Yeah, start with you, Priscilla.
Okay. I haven't really employed this yet, but last week I got in touch with my forensic chemist friend and said, what's going on? But essentially he said that partly in the 1980s when DNA was first used, and I think he mentioned a case in England, you had to have a pretty big sample. You had to have a big splatter. He says now they can almost go by a single cell. They're in the US, and I relied on this in my first book, though I don't name it, there's the CODIS system that the FBI runs. So there's a national base for DNA collected from crime scenes. But on the other hand, there's the issue of, let me start again. I think we think there's a contrast between messy, fatal human motivation and the clarity and objectivity of science. We would like to think it's that way. But if you look at some real cases, one is the notorious Central Park 5, in which Black teenage boys were sent to prison. And there was at that time DNA evidence on the jogger was beaten nearly to death and had no memory of the event. DNA evidence, and the DNA did not belong to a single one of them. And so that unwillingness to look at that evidence. Another case is the real case of the Boston Strangler, where maybe for very valid reasons, people believed, and I think it was DeSalvo's innocence, but at one point, his body was exhumed to sort of in 2013. I mean, these crimes go back to the 60s. I had a great aunt in Boston at that time who was terrified. But anyway, they had to exhume his body to try to put that to rest by collecting DNA from his body and comparing it to the one DNA sample they had. So there's that it can seem so incredibly good, but that it can be so distrusted at the same time.
Yeah, and at the scale of a single cell, then you have real chain of custody questions, right? Yeah. Marcia, what things have you learned?
Well, I read an article recently. I haven't figured out how to use it yet, but they're getting so sophisticated they can actually now distinguish one identical twin from another from DNA.
Very good.
And every time you turn around, there's some new advance. So I thought that was fascinating. And I just think that these databases that the public has access to just give the citizen detective so much to work with. And that fascinates me, to be able to even join. I've been reading about crowdsourcing, where there's some people who put together Facebook pages, Twitter pages, and so on, where people like you and me can go online and get into these databases. There's one called the Murder Accountability Project, where you can actually search on various data points like location and age of victim and sex of victim and so on, and find locate things and help solve crimes, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, I want to ask Lissa this, there's this idea that correlation is not causation, so a connection might not be meaningful. When you hear about people crowdsourcing crime solutions as a law enforcement person, how does that strike you?
Well, for me, any help, when I was on the job, any help that anyone could give us, I was more than willing to take in, and we would have, I was involved in a very high profile case here in Western New York with a serial killer and who had terrorized Western New York for 30 years. And after his last murder, I was put on the task force, and we did end up making an arrest. Altemio Sanchez was the bike path murderer, and he is in jail now forever, hopefully. And in the process of that, in the process of investigating that cold case, we realized that there was a man in jail with for rapes that the bike path rapist had committed. So in the process of trying to find a serial killer, we also ended up trying to get this innocent man out of jail and finding the evidence to convict a serial killer and finding the evidence to get an innocent person out of jail at the same time. Wow. So, and all during this, you talk about like crowdsourcing on murders, we would have the old fashioned way was the tip line. They would set up telephone tip lines and people would call in the tips, and we read every single tip that came in. And so that's the idea of crowdsourcing has been around well before there was the internet. There was the tip line. I think probably everyone remembers, back in the 70s and 80s, if you have any information, call this phone number, and that's basically the same idea, only technology has made it even more accessible. And we really did look at things on the internet, tips that came in, You know, those, you never know where that one, because most cold cases hinge on one thing to break the case, and you never know where that one thing is going to come from.
Fascinating. Martin, what is the coolest thing that you learned, or the grossest thing, or whatever?
Well, I must add, I don't really major on forensic science because I rely very heavily on friends who are forensic experts when I run into a forensic issue. Husband and wife, who are both forensic scientists, interestingly, in England. So there are forensic aspects to the Lake District stories, but I'm always very wary about relying on cutting edge science, because what you see, I think, in a lot of books written in the past is that what was cutting edge some years ago isn't that novel today. And so I try not to date the books too much in that particular way with the technology. Same with changing money, that sort of thing. But one book I did write, which isn't a book that became very well known at all, but a book I've always been very proud of, was a book called Dancing with the Hangman, which is about the Crippen case. And it was an attempt to tell the story of the Crippen case in the form of a novel from Crippen's point of view. And I was very interested when in the past few years, members of the family, I think, and lawyers came along with DNA samples which allegedly prove that the body in the cellar murdered by Crippen wasn't Crippen's wife. So the case against him, if you believe that, falls away. But of course, that's although sensational, it then raises a host of other questions like, who did that body belong to, and how did it get there, and all that sort of thing. And is it more likely that actually something went wrong with the sample over the course of 100 years? So I tend to be not so much a skeptic about these advances, because I think they're hugely important. But I think that one always has to ask questions about the miraculous technology, and it's the asking of the questions rather than the technology itself that really fascinates me.
Yeah, and here in San Francisco, we had one person working in a lab who was an addict, and so I think every single scientific opinion she offered over the course of, I don't even know how far back they went, had to be re-examined. So yeah, you can fall down a well.
And Lissa's point about crowdsourcing far predating the internet is a very, very good illustration, I think, of this point that things change all the time, technology changes, but a lot of things within that wrapper stay the same and remain constant in some way.
Yeah, I've often wondered, will there be a time when the crowdsourcing people are like, oh, we think this guy is it, and they go after that person and that person is it, and then that person can disappear before the professional law enforcement can get involved. But I don't think that's happened yet. So I just make up things to worry about. So here's a question for everyone. Is there, in fiction, is there a cold case trope, a cold case sort, not necessarily cliche, but commonly occurring event that you would love to see banished from all future cold case fiction? Or is this subgenre so sort of fresh and new that we're still just exploring everything? Your thoughts on that are most welcome. Whoever wants to start. Or maybe it's a bad question and I should move on.
No, it's a great question. I'll have a go at it. Well, I don't have a perfectly formed answer. That's for sure. But I think that the issue for me with all genre tropes, not just cold case, is that it's terribly difficult to write something new, something that nobody else has ever thought of before. It's more about finding fresh and interesting ways to do something that probably lots of other people did, but your voice, your approach makes it special and unique. And I think that's true of tropes in cold case fiction, as it is in other types of fiction. That there's a lot of talk now about domestic suspense, hugely important area of fiction, enormously popular. And of course, domestic suspense, one thing it isn't is new. You know, The Moonstone, Wilkie Collins, 1860. So it things are done in a different way. We all bring our perspectives and the times we live in to the stories that we write. But for me, it's not so much that a trope is bad. It's what you do with it that really matters. Do you use it well? Do you give it some sort of fresh life?
Anyone else?
No.
I think writers are very good at following what's going on in the headlines and the new technologies and reflecting that in their writing. So as far as crime fiction that deals with cold cases that I see writers really stepping up and following along with the new technology. And I think it's great.
Cool.
20 years ago, there were no such thing as podcasts. And now podcasts are a great trope that you see in cold case fiction, you know, and I can't wait to see what happens next.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm editing a question as I read it. I had this thought. Oh, well, let me ask this. Do you think there will ever be a day when it's just, I mean, there will probably always be crimes of passion, people lashing out and killing someone in a fit of anger that they didn't plan, that kind of thing. But that aside, do you think there'll ever come a day where we humans just think, oh, murders are always caught. Murder is no longer my best solution to this problem. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think that every one of my books, it seems to me, has started out because somebody that I know or somebody in my life needs to die. So, I think this is universal. I mean, we all have our list. You know, Gilbert and Sullivan had a little list of people that would never be missed. And, I think that that's human nature. I really think that it'll be forever. I mean, I was reading the other day, there's this meme called Florida Man, because there's a lot of crazy people who live in Florida. And I spent a lot of time in Florida recently. But, what makes a woman get dressed up in a clown suit, put on clown makeup, and go to the house of her husband's mistress and shoot her? And then 3 or 4 years later, it was a cold case. All they knew was that this woman had been shot by somebody in a clown suit. And eventually, the woman who had worn the clown suit got drunk and confessed. And so they figured out who it was. But
criminal mastermind.
Yeah, I know. But, human nature, I think that it'll always be around. There's always going to be somebody who wants to put somebody else away for whatever reason. Just because the world would be a better place without that person.
Well, I agree with Marcia, though, again, I'm using my source here. If you're kind of curious where some of the new developments might be, one thing he's working on is fiber analysis, and on TV shows, maybe that's something that is often problematic on TV shows, which do, yes, abbreviate things and fit in between commercials. Fibers are very easily matched, and maybe Lissa can speak to this, but if you don't have DNA evidence on a white t-shirt fiber from Walmart, it's really hard to say which white t-shirt that came from, and that's something he's working on. Hair is most easily connected with somebody if there's DNA on the root from the skin. What if there isn't? That's another thing that's being worked on, and this is the one I think I like the best: human scent tracing. In other words, can a forensic lab do what a dog does easily? Walk through a room and know who's been there by scent, and even 2 days ago. But I think what we're finding is science is way behind the dog.
Yeah. I was reading that there's a dog that sniffs COVID. You probably saw that article. They have this, a couple of dogs now in airports, and the accuracy is uncanny, like 99%, something like that. Dogs are amazing.
Lisa, I'm making sure I'm unmuted. Yeah. Let me ask you directly. I got in this groove where I started watching all of this true crime stuff on TV. I heard a comic once say that women don't watch true crime, they study it. But she was a woman, so she could say that. But I was haunted by this question: what makes anyone think this is the best solution to their problem? And in your work, did you have any insight? What makes someone think that making a dead body that's dead forever is the best solution to their problem?
You know, there are crimes of passion. You know, this goes back to the dawn of time. You know, the three things: lust, greed, and power. You know, you can go all the way back to Cain and Abel, you know, in the Bible, you know, and for whatever reason, human beings were fallible, and there's always going to be a struggle, you know, for those three things: lust, greed, and power, for whatever it is. And so murder for people that are consumed by one of those three things will always be an option to them. To I'm going to use air quotes, to a normal person, that it wouldn't even enter their heads. But when you're consumed by one of those three things, you know, that can drive even a so-called normal person to do something that they would not necessarily do, you know. And I think that's something that a lot of writers explore in their crime fiction. The person that's driven for whatever reason to do something they wouldn't normally do, you know, the sweet old lady that stabs someone with their knitting needles for whatever reason, you know. That's something that crime fiction writers have been exploring and examining, that whole dynamic of what can turn a person who in a million years you would never think would commit a crime, what can drive them? What's the force driving them to commit that murder?
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Martin, you're talking to a bunch of Americans from a very violent culture. How does the picture look from the UK?
Well, I think that Lisa's point just now is really spot on, because it's this idea, particularly in mystery fiction. It's very appealing, and from a writer's point of view, with these Lake District mysteries, the cold case mysteries that I've been writing for some years now, my starting point with each novel, and I try to make each novel quite distinct, but my starting point is always, why would this person, who appears to be quite a pleasant person, want to do something so terrible to that person, who doesn't seem necessarily like somebody who give rise to motives for murder? And as Lissa was saying, it's this behaviour out of character, or is it out of character? We don't know. That helps you to weave a whodunit. So for me, it's a very interesting starting point, and coming up with that interesting motivation is really the starting point for each of my Lake District mysteries. The other series I've written, both the Liverpool series and the more recent one, which is set in 1930, that they're written in a different way. But the Lake District mysteries, it all begins with this motivation, and as Lissa was saying, it's the concealed motivation that fascinates me. The fact that that you should suspect everyone, as Agatha Christie once said.
Well, one thing I'm interested in, maybe for a standalone mystery, is what happens when there's exoneration, because one of the great advances from all the science is that the innocent, as Lissa was saying, can be found innocent. But then what happens? Is the case then unsolved? Is a family who, say, lost a child, what happens to them after that? I noticed in chat somebody was talking about revenge. Will somebody want revenge, especially if it was some people were framed to be put in prison? There's all kinds of emotional and ethical implications. I mean, we think, yes, exoneration, we have justice, but I don't think it's that simple. I think exoneration is wonderful, but then the crime has been unsolved again often. Not always, as Lissa was saying, sometimes you find it's exonerated because they found the true criminal. But still, I think there's a lot of open-endedness about what happens when somebody says, guess what, this person did not do it.
Mm.
And there was a recent change of the law in Britain, which enabled somebody to be tried for a second time if new evidence came to light. And that was prompted by a particular case where somebody was acquitted and then found to be guilty after all, so to speak. So that resulted in changing the criminal law. And again, it shows that these cases can go on and on over the years and have all sorts of implications for the family of the bereaved, but also the suspect as well, the people who are unjustly suspected.
So did the law in the UK before this change have the double jeopardy concept where you couldn't do that?
Exactly, and in fact, there's going back to Agatha Christie again, that one of her early and very fine whodunits is based exactly on that premise that you can't be found guilty twice. That's the great plot twist of that particular story.
I think I've forgotten more Agatha Christie than I remember at this point, sadly. All right, so Janet, just a heads up, we're going to take questions, but first I want to ask each author to tell us about the next project coming up that they're excited about. And let's start with Lissa.
So the next book in my cold case investigation series, I wanted to get away from homicide a little. So it's actually about a cold case of the theft of a Picasso, where my main character has to track this Picasso from a private residence here in the States to Ireland. So it's, it's once again sort of a fish out of water to Ireland, where she's trying to find this missing Picasso, which I had a lot of fun with this book because I had to delve into the world of art theft. And what a lot of people don't realize is, so you steal a $20 million painting. Now, what do you do with it? You can't take it to the local pawn shop. You have this painting and, and I'm speaking to art experts, you find out, and art crime experts, you find out a lot of these paintings end up in storage facilities on the thief's grandmother's wall because they get it and they have nothing to do with it. So, it was a lot of fun to write about what happens to these stolen artifacts. And I really, really enjoyed it. And that'll be coming out next year from Severn House.
Cool. Priscilla.
Well, I have sort of two things in mind. One for the detective series will somehow involve real estate scandals because some properties are to die for. Forgive me for saying that. But I do want to avoid the trope. We're talking about what tropes you want to avoid. I don't want to have somebody dig up a parking lot and find Richard III because that's already been done. And then, as I said, I'm toying with what happens in an exoneration case. What new messes are created by that?
Sounds fascinating. Marcia.
I have a book coming out also from Severn House in January, and it's called Done Gone. And it's Hannah and her, Hannah has a monthly dinner club, and their neighbors who have been coming faithfully just failed to show up for one Italian night. And it seems that they've just disappeared. The lights are on, the car's in the drive. As somebody that knows them says, it's like they've been raptured up. And that's where the story starts. And I get to explore some, I hate the term ripped from the headlines, but I get to explore some recent issues involving very powerful men who behave badly, let's say.
Absolutely.
Done Gone.
Cool. Martin.
Well, I've been away from the Lake District and the cold cases for a number of years now because I've been writing these other books set in 1930, Gallows Court and Mortmain Hall. So it was really time to go back to the lakes, and I enjoyed doing that. And luckily, I got all my research in just before the pandemic, and I used the pandemic to do the writing. So the next Lake District book is called The Crooked Shore. Again, it's a slightly different variation on the series, the basic themes of the series. That's coming out sometime next year. I don't know exactly when in the United States yet, but I've really enjoyed after one break going back to Hannah Scarlett and Daniel Kind and finding out what they've been up to in the meantime. So it's been a great deal of fun. And you'll gather from the picture, by the way, that it's getting darker in England. So I'm just going to put the light on in a moment. Otherwise
Absolutely.
I'll disappear completely.
Great. Janet, were you able to track the questions, or should I dive in there and try to get back to the first one?
I tracked some of the questions.
Excellent.
I sent you a message if you want to kind of read it. I sent you a private message, or I can read it if you like.
Janet is on top of it. Okay. So we've had a couple questions about true crime podcasts. What are the favorite true crime podcasts that you all listen to and recommend?
My favorite murder. I love that podcast. Those two women crack me up.
Anyone else?
Believe it or not, I don't follow true crime podcasts. I'm afraid that if I dive into them, I won't come out.
Oh. You won't.
I won't. I know I won't. I know I won't.
It's like doing ancestry. You know, you go down that rabbit hole, you're done. The day's gone.
But I know it's just a matter of time.
Priscilla or Martin, any favorites come to mind?
I'm not a podcast true crime, I should say, podcast listener either. So I read a lot of true crime books. I wrote one myself many years ago, but it's really the books and articles along the line as I go for rather than podcasts.
I should put in a plug for Michelle McNamara's book, which Lissa mentioned. It's absolutely wonderful. And also there's I think it was a 6-part Netflix special where they were filming while she was still alive that I just think is brilliant.
Yeah, I'll Be Gone in the Dark. I think that's the name of the special too, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Who is your favorite TV forensic scientist? And maybe why?
Well, I watched the Vera series and they keep changing, but at least those scientists seem more plausible than some because they isn't the same person in the lab. I mean, I guess, you know, NCIS is often held up as the very fun show that's absolutely unrealistic because, you know, like one person in one small room has all this equipment to find things out within about 3 hours. So I think that's one of the things that for the sake of narrative is often just too compressed in fictional TV shows.
Yeah, I like the way that the forensic scientists in Inspector Morse and a Scottish series that went on for many years in the UK. I don't know if you know it, called Taggart. That was very strong in the 90s, and the relationship between the forensics guy and the detectives was a very good aspect of what was a really great series.
I like the cranky man from Midsummer Murders from the earlier episodes because he never really helped. But he knew everything, but he was so cranky. I just loved it.
Yeah, we've been binge watching Midsummer Murders, and we just did episode 100 last night. This is our COVID lockdown. My husband and I can agree on, and I'm with you. I like that first guy, and he just disappeared. No explanation, and now we have a young girl who's I guess she's going to be a love interest, I suppose. But yeah, I don't know. No explanation. He just vanished, but I liked him. I love irascible characters.
Exactly. All righty. Here's a question, and hopefully you can answer it. Have your publisher's lawyers ever advised you to step back from a story? Like, don't tell that story. The person who asked has had that experience, and she just wonders if it's common, or has it happened to anyone else, I guess.
Not me.
Well, I am a lawyer, but not a criminal lawyer, an employment lawyer, labour lawyer, and so I'm naturally averse to exposing either my publishers or myself to litigation. So I suppose caution in that respect is built into my DNA. So no, it hasn't happened to me, not so far.
Well, one issue I'm facing is my books, which they're both serious and comic, as many crime novels are, but they're set in the Twin Cities, and they are fiction. But I think I have to acknowledge in the one I'm working on now that the atmosphere has changed. But I think I have worked with a diversity sensitivity reader in the past, but in that case, it's more of an issue of, I think I have to show that Minneapolis has changed since COVID, and certainly since the killing of George Floyd. So it's like, this is one thing where I hope to work through in drafts, but how do you handle such sensitive issues without denying them? You don't want to do that, but respectfully and appropriately.
Absolutely. One of the audience members says that they want to get more details about a real cold case, but don't know how to get started. And a former classmate of theirs was murdered in 1990, and the case is unsolved. He or she would like to write about it, to bring attention to it, and maybe fictionalize it. But how do you find out more about a cold case if you're not a detective?
The first thing that you would probably want to do is file Freedom of Information Act to get the file from the police department. We used to field those all the time. They can't give you, because technically a cold case is still an active case, they can't give you the entire file, but they can give you enough to get a start. At least my department would never release crime scene photos, for obvious reasons. And, certain information about suspects, especially ones that have been exonerated or ruled out. But because the case is still open, but it would definitely be the place to start, the jumping off point, to just call your local police department wherever it happened and ask to find out who the officer is that's in charge of Freedom of Information Act requests.
Cool. We have one last question, unless there's follow-up on that from anyone. Our last question is, what myths about forensic science need to be dispelled? It just shouldn't be trotted out anymore.
Well, go ahead, Lissa.
No, I was just going to say, I think the myth that DNA is the be-all, end-all of solving a crime, because we used to say, DNA is the icing on the cake, but you still have to bake the cake. You have to be able to put DNA into a context, because just because the husband or wife's DNA is in the crime scene, if they live in the house, it's supposed to be in the crime scene. So you have to look not only at what's there, but also what's not there. I would be more suspicious if I looked at someone's house and there was no one's DNA anywhere in the house, which that would raise a red flag, because someone went and meticulously went and cleaned that crime scene. So, you also have to factor in other pieces of evidence along with the DNA to frame the evidence to show the entire picture of the crime. So I would like to see that myth of DNA as you get a DNA and you automatically have the case solved. And that is not true.
I was listening to one of yesterday's sessions in which Ian Rankin spoke, and he was talking about there's a price tag on investigations in the UK. And I don't know if there's exactly that in the US, but certainly rape kits have piled up over the years because there haven't been the resources. So I think you do run into the question of how well will the science continue to be funded? And, will these data banks be allowed to go on publicly anyway and legally? The US does not have a registry of who owns guns for political reasons, but they do have CODIS. DNA, that was allowed to go through, but I think there's still forensic science too is subject to politics, privacy, all the other social environment things that go on.
Yeah. So I am sad to say we are at the end of our time. Thank our panelists so much. I have learned so much listening to you all. And Janet, for your technical assistance, we couldn't do it without you. And Chris, too, is totally behind the scenes. Thank you all. And I've really enjoyed our time together.
Thank you. It was
Thank
good.
you.
And look
Thank
these
you
writers
so
up.
much.
They're the real deal.
Goodbye.
Thank you.